Hello, I'm Bruno Sarda, and welcome to the EY Sustainability Matters podcast, our regular look at ESG and sustainability topics and how they impact businesses around the globe. In this episode, the second one in our mini-series about ESG disclosures, we're going to talk about biodiversity and the emergence of natural capital accounting and nature-based disclosures. Today, we will be focusing particularly on the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TNFD for short. The majority of focus in the sustainability space to date has been on the climate crisis, in part due to increased attention from investors and regulators, with biodiversity and depletion of natural resources receiving less attention from most companies. However, biodiversity and natural capital play an important role in achieving a net zero future, among other key roles, and businesses need to begin to recognize the strong dependency our economy and their companies have on nature. Most recently, the United Nations Biodiversity Conference, COP15, held in Montreal in December 2022, showcased this increased focus on developing nature-positive ambitions with 15,000 total participants and representation from 188 governments and over 1,000 companies. This was a welcome contrast from the limited attendance and representation from companies at previous biodiversity COPs. And COP15 ended in a historic agreement, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF, being signed with 4 overarching long-term goals to 2050 and 23 action-oriented global targets to be delivered by 2030, including to protect and restore 30% of the Earth's land and water. So as businesses and their stakeholders start to recognize biodiversity as a business priority and begin to consider their impact and reliance on nature, there will be an increasing need for transparent natural capital disclosures to help achieve these global biodiversity targets. This is where the TNFD comes in. It was launched in 2021 and built on the success of the TCFD, the Taskforce on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, to help businesses move towards investments and decision-making that have a positive effect on nature and biodiversity by paving a way for companies to assess, disclose, and manage nature-related financial impacts and dependencies. The TNFD framework is set to be finalized in September 2023, and this past November 2022, the task force, which is a body of 40 individual task force members representing financial institutions, corporations, and market services providers, released a third version of the TNFD beta framework and invited businesses to provide feedback on the framework. So today, with me to discuss the importance of biodiversity, of the TNFD, and its potential impact on businesses, I'm delighted to welcome Alexis Gazzo, a fellow EY partner based in Paris, France, who is a member of the TNFD task force, as well as Marine de Bazelaire, group advisor on natural capital at HSBC, and also a member of the TNFD task force. Welcome to both of you. So, Marine, let's start with you, maybe for our listeners that may not be as familiar with biodiversity and natural capital. Could you provide an overview of what biodiversity and natural capital are and the challenges facing both of these topics and their role in a net zero future?
Thank you very much, Bruno and Alexis, for inviting me on this podcast. And yes, thank you also for starting with this question, because actually there's a lot of different terms that need to be defined for us all to understand how to tackle the issue. So to start with, what do we mean by nature? Well, nature, it's a quite easy one. It refers to land, ocean, fresh water, and atmosphere. When you hear atmosphere, you already hear climate. And so what is natural capital? Well, it consists in the stocks of nature-related assets, like food, like water, like shelter, etc. And that capital gives rise to what we call flows of benefits to people and the economy. In other words, to ecosystem services like crop pollination, water purification, etc. And actually, the value of the so-called ecosystem services are estimated to be worth 100 to 25 to 140 trillion US dollars by the OECD. And so, what is biodiversity in all that? Well, biodiversity is what enables those ecosystem services delivered by nature to be productive, resilient, and adaptable. That's how the Dasgupta report has actually defined biodiversity. We all know here that value does not mean price. And actually, most of the value that is incurred by those ecosystem services is not priced in economic models. I mean, we get the price when we have a cost. And as a consequence, biodiversity is degrading at an unprecedented rate. And this poses a systemic risk to the global economy. And this is one of the reasons why the TNFD that you presented earlier was actually needed. Your last question was actually on the climate-nature nexus. Well, there is no net zero without halting nature loss, meaning you cannot envisage the global economy to reach the Paris Agreement if you don't tackle at the same time nature-related issue. And the thing is that given its depletion, if we don't reallocate capital now toward nature protection and restoration, there's no chance that we will limit the temperature rise as we all want to.
Well, thank you for this framing, Marine. I think that was extremely helpful to put a very complex set of topics, I think, in the frame of our conversation. So, Alexis, maybe if you can then explain to us in the context of all of these variables, what is, in fact, the Taskforce for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD, and how is it seeking to address the challenges facing biodiversity loss and natural capital erosion?
Yes, thank you, Bruno, for the question, for inviting me, of course. Well, the TNFD is a voluntary initiative. As you mentioned, that is a bit walking in the same steps as the TCFD. So the idea is really to provide a framework both for investors and corporates to understand and to define risks and opportunities related to biodiversity and nature in general. So the objective of the task force is to provide a toolbox, basically, of items that will support both issuers and investors to, on one hand, have an approach to be able to define their exposure to risks, dependencies, impacts in terms of biodiversity, and to support it, identifying a number of criteria and metrics also to manage these risks and opportunities. So for the moment, the TNFD is trying to stay rather consistent with the way in which the TCFD was built. The idea is not to multiply too much frameworks for issuers and investors, but really to have a consistency in the way in which the two initiatives are structured. It's, an iterative process, as you indicated. So there will be a next release of the beta framework at the end of March, which then will follow a last round of iteration so as to lead to a final release in the autumn of 2023. So for me, it's a very structuring framework, which will provide much more information on how to manage, this subject matter of biodiversity, which, as Marine explained, is quite complex and obviously very strategic for businesses, although all don't know it as yet.
Great. Well, thanks for that explanation. So maybe bringing those two things together, then, Marine, based on all of the dimensions you described, which were really, planetary societal constructs, and the TNFD ultimately is a mechanism for organizations to report on things. What does the TNFD, in fact, measure? What data will companies have to collect and report in order to align with it?
That's a very good question. And as Alexis said, it's still work in progress. So the final metrics that will be recommended to the one that adopt the TNFD framework are not settled yet. There's obviously no lack of data. There's really large pool of data that corporates can use to assess their exposure to nature-related risk, but data are not sufficient. You need metric and you need targets, actually. And so this is still work in progress. The way the framework has been built for now is using what is called a LEAP approach, meaning an approach that is turning around locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare, LEAP. locate your interface with nature, evaluate your dependencies and impacts, assess your risks and opportunities, prepare to respond to nature-related risks and opportunities, and report. And actually, that question of locating, evaluating, assessing is around conducting a materiality assessment to start with. And it will really depend from one corporate to another, from one financial institution to another. It depends on what your footprint is, where are your relationship with nature. And actually, we think that the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure is giving the right path for corporates and financial institutions to start understanding their impact and dependency, their relation to nature.
Great, thank you. So both of you, as I mentioned earlier, were fortunate to have two members of the TNFD task force. So can you maybe tell us how have organizations so far been reacting to the beta framework, and how can or should businesses get involved to influence maybe the final stages of the framework? Maybe Alexis, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think the TNFD framework, I think, is attracting a lot of attention. And, we've seen already that at COP15, there was really a step change in the level of involvement and of commitment of corporates and investors around this topic, because, COP15 was a bit similar to COP21 for climate, the first COP where you see a really massive contribution from the private sector. So, I think today a lot of organizations are following quite closely how the TNFD is developing the beta framework. I think it's several hundreds of corporates and investors as well, which have engaged. Obviously, there are some righteous concerns about the possible burden in terms of additional metrics and data to manage. Marie mentioned there's no shortage of data, but actually the quantity of data to manage can be very important given the complexity of biodiversity, given the location-specific aspect of many impacts and dependencies related to biodiversity. So it's quite complex, and obviously, I think it creates some concern about the feasibility of applying these frameworks. Knowing that, again, what is being developed in TNFD comes in articulation with other developments, which are also very important around the ISFP, around the CSRD in Europe. So I think on the one hand, there are some concerns about the feasibility, to be very frank, of these new developments. And there's also a lot of interest on how to be a step in advance in understanding one's exposure to these risk dependencies and taking the right first steps to correctly identify, assess, evaluate these risks. And I think on that, the LEAP approach is one good way to get started, basically. I think that the LEAP approach that Marine presented provides for issuers in particular a way basically to guide the first steps to try to get a correct understanding of one's exposure. We are seeing a number of corporates who have engaged in deploying pilots with the TNFD, which is an interesting approach to get involved. So I think there are many ways, either to really work by developing a pilot with TNFD, or simply to implement the LEAP approach on what side. And we are seeing a number of companies from different sectors, which is interesting, getting their hands around the LEAP approach. So I think it's very promising for the next stages, knowing that today, for some very key questions, such as, what metrics should we use? How can we fix a target? Well, many of these questions are still pretty open because we don't yet have a completely harmonized view on what should be the metrics, how to set the target. I mean, all these are work in progress.
Great. Thanks, Alexis. And of course, Marine, you have an interesting position that the financial sector is both a producer of information, but also then the intended recipients of a lot of these disclosures. So can you say, from your perspective, both from, within HSBC and other financial institutions, what has that involvement with the beta framework and TNFD been so far?
Thank you for this question. we haven't seen a lot of financial institutions participating to the first data framework. Then we've seen more with the second one, even more with the third one. Now there's more than 40 pilots that involve financial institutions. Yes, the topic is complex. Being said that, as we have said earlier, it's a systemic risk for the global economy. The Network on Greening the Financial System has released a report last year that is actually demonstrating that more than half of the global economy is directly dependent on nature. Actually, the global economy is fully dependent on nature, but half of it is directly dependent on nature. And so, in any case, this topic needs to be addressed. And I think that the approach of the TNFD is quite a smart one. It's like a software approach with this iterative process, with everyone being invited to test it, so to refine it, so to understand its relation with nature, and so to start to plan. We're not going to end up with a perfect solution in September. Hopefully, we're going to end up with a robust framework to engage in that approach, and then it's a phased one. Remember, for TCFD, the time frame was 5 years. We're going to see with TNFD how many years we propose companies to align with when deciding to adopt the TNFD framework. Coming back to your question, there's more than 40 financial institutions that are now testing the beta framework to understand what is the impact of nature loss on their portfolio in different parts of the world.
Great. No, thanks for that update. That's very interesting. So as we talked about earlier, this COP15 that just took place at the end of 2022 ended with a historic agreement, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, with the intent to protect and restore nature. And just, Alexis, you mentioned, it was kind of maybe the equivalent of what COP21 was for the climate movement, or that led to the Paris Agreement and became truly a big inflection point in climate action. How do you see COP15 and then this new agreement influencing private sector action in this space and the adoption of the TNFD? Marine, do you want to weigh in on that too?
Well, as Alexis said, it's the first time that for a COP on biodiversity, the private sector is really there, represented, and asking to have clear goals and enablers to tackle that risk. And I think that the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, came up actually with that overarching goal, 2050 vision, and a clear ambition for the global economy to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. This target in itself is very important for the private sector. It's a first target. Then, if you look at the 23 underlying targets to achieve that goal to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030, there's a lot of sub-targets. I mean, if you look at, for example, the subsidies that are harming nature, it has the power to change business models. And actually, it has also in itself, risks and opportunities for financial institutions to reallocate capital toward that kind of economy. If you look also actually as one that is very much aligned with the TNFD Target 15, it's certainly an enabler going forward for large corporates and financial institutions to start to understand what I've said earlier, their relation to nature. So Target 15 is specifically saying governments ensure that large corporates and financial institutions assess, manage, and report on their impacts and dependencies, risks linked to nature along the value chain. And all those terms are the overarching principles of TNFD, except that in TNFD, you add opportunities. But otherwise, it's the exact same one. So I think it's supporting the thinking that is behind the TNFD. It's helping regulators to already turn to an existing framework, even if it's still work in progress, to enforce that kind of target going forward. And it's actually giving a clear signal to the global economy that they will have to assess that risk going forward.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Marine. Maybe if I can follow up then, Alexis, on a question. So Marine just mentioned, the Target 15, which is about asking governments to encourage companies. You mentioned in your earlier comments some of these other framework developments. I think you referenced the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, as well as the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that itself has a bunch of underlying standards, some of which relate to biodiversity. How is the TNFD aligned with some of these other frameworks, maybe others like the SBTN, the Science-Based Target for Nature's, and or other standards? What efforts are being discussed or underway to try to harmonize all of these different frameworks to ensure business ultimately adoption and kind of comparability of data?
Yeah. Before I answer this question, I'd like just to say a word on the GBF and Target 15 and complement to what Marine said. It's really striking for me to hear a lot of companies, of organizations saying that the GBF is at last, the international framework that they were waiting for to really have a structure on, again, what we are aiming for in terms of long-term biodiversity targets. And not only does it fix, goals and targets, and Marine explained that, but it also comes with a number of supporting measures, monitoring measures, the idea that at every COP, countries will come back to, measure progress, countries will need to build national biodiversity strategies and so forth. So, it's their whole package, which I think is very encouraging in the objectives that we're targeting for 2030. And yes, Target 15 for me is also very interesting because it's specifically aiming at private sector, corporations and investors, which is not necessarily usual in international agreements like this. I mean, you don't have a target like that in climate agreements. So it's really interesting to see this Target 15, which, as you said, is asking governments to take policy measures so that companies will regularly monitor, assess, and transparently disclose the risk, dependencies, and impact. So again, I'm a bit repeating what Marine said, but I think it's worth it because it's really something which is out of the ordinary. And yes, I think this will put pressure on companies. And I think this feeds well with the TNFD, which, as we said earlier, is there to provide guidance on how do you actually disclose and monitor your exposure. So to come back to your question at last, so yes, the TNFD is a flexible framework. I mean, it's there to provide guidance, but to stay flexible so that it can be articulated with different jurisdictions, with different rules that may exist. And so there is a whole process from the start that has been developed to liaise with teams from ISSB, from EFRAG, CSRD, with SBTN on target setting. And again, you see some of the terms used by TNFD in the GBF. You see some of the terms in TNFD that are also used in the SRS, E4, and so on. So there are connections with the different teams working on these different initiatives. It's a good thing because, again, consistency is important. And again, the TNFD is being flexible because all these different initiatives are also a work in progress. So basically, we're, driving the car as we build it. And so you need to keep this form of flexibility and connectivity.
Great. Thank you for that, Alexis. So I think as we start looking to wrap this conversation, I want to bring it back down to the fact that, many of our listeners and many of the organizations looking to kind of what the future means are in fact trying to solve for this at the organizational level. So maybe, Marine, if I could start with you, kind of how is HSBC as such a large global financial institution preparing for all of these voluntary frameworks and standards and regulations coming up?
So for now, we have conducted preliminary assessment using the Anchor database, which is a UNWCMC initiative that enables any kind of financial institutions to run part or full of its portfolio. So to understand what is its exposure to nature-related impacts and dependencies. So that's the first exercise that we have done for a third of our large corporate loan book. Then finding out that that portfolio was mostly exposed to water-related risks, we have conducted a specific stress test of a very small part of our portfolio of heavy industry in Asia to understand what would be the impact, the financial impact of a 3 months water curtailment, such as the one that happened in Cape Town a couple of years ago, which is a realistic scenario in the region where those industries were located. And we found out that a third of that portfolio would move to investment grade, meaning that that risk that we've never assessed before, that we've never looked at before, probably already occurred without us making the link between nature and that risks, and that we need to prepare to tackle it. So we don't have all the answers yet, but we are starting to pilot that. Following those exercises, we have agreed to participate to 4 different pilots. One led in Asia on the real estate sector, along with WWF and EY. Another one along with UNEP on our continental Europe portfolio to see the impact of natural rubber on our portfolio in Europe. Meaning here that was really a question of value chain. Were we able to track the right data to assess the impact of the tire industry, actually, and the automotive industry, its exposure to that risk? Then we've also joined another pilot with Phoenix here for our joint venture with Pollination, which is called Climate Asset Management, specifically on nature-related real assets, forestry and agriculture, and see the resilience between different types of assets to nature-related risks. And then a fourth one to assess the resilience of our agri-food portfolio in Europe. So all of those are enabling all of us to understand how to assess the risk, the kind of result we can have before actually getting a larger approach that is still ahead of us in what is going to be the phased approach for our group going forward.
Thank you so much for these very concrete examples. I think that'll give a lot of very practical insights to those listening. Alexis, you lead a lot of this work for EY. You work with many organizations that are not necessarily as far along. How can companies that aren't quite as mature or far along on this as HSBC begin to prepare for biodiversity and natural capital disclosures? Where do you usually advise for them to start?
Well, I think there's obviously always a first step, which is try to educate and to familiarize the management with biodiversity concepts, tools, frameworks. And always, I think, an important step in terms of trying to get a better understanding from the C-suite, basically, of the company on what the topic is about, why does it matter, why is it a risk and opportunity as well, but also a risk for a number of businesses and value chain. I think the other step is to try to use the existing frameworks that exist, the existing guidance, and here obviously TNFD is an important item. It may not be the only one. There are other sources which are interesting, but I think TNFD is a good way to basically map the different steps that you can embark in. And the first step that the deep approach developed by TNFD it includes is about the location aspect. And so locating the different activities and trying to map potential impacts of these activities on the different ecosystems in which they are located is very important. Obviously, it means that you need to manage both geographical data from your sites, but also data maybe in terms of purchasing, the other aspects, which are more operational data from your sites. And you need to connect that with a number of data sets on the ecosystems. So that's a lot of data to manage, but that's why we're seeing more and more digital solutions to help navigate this. And then beyond that, I think, the next steps will be really to try to continue on the LEAP approach, but in parallel to develop skills and, technologies that will be useful going forward. Because this, a process that you're embarking in, not just for a few days or weeks, but rather for a few years' time. We're really at the start of the curve in terms of the learning process. Many items are still missing, as we said, in terms of, converging and fully accepted metrics or, long-term scenarios. All of this is not fully built, but it's important, straight away, I think, to get a correct understanding of what this is about. And so educate and, initiate the LEAP approach. And this starts by, again, a very operational assessment of your sites and their exposure to different risks and dependencies.
Well, great. Thanks for that, Alexis. This is such a rich topic. I could keep you both here for hours and not run out of things to learn and things to unpack. But for the interest of time, maybe to wrap up this insightful conversation, what are both of your kind of hopes for how business and the private sector will support the achievement of these biodiversity goals and targets agreed at COP15? Maybe Marine, start with you.
I mean, I think we're on the right track. I think there has been, in a very short time period, a lot of tools, enablers for the global economy to understand what's happening. I mean, remember the IPBES report that was ringing the red light was in 2019. And then the Dasgupta report that made for the first time a comprehensive link between nature loss and the economy is from 2021. And now, end of 2022, we have comprehensive global agreement with a lot of central banks actually looking at it to prepare for regulation for large corporates and financial institutions to understand how to tackle that risk. So I have hope. And I think that if I could give one advice is just to start, test it, start.
Alexis?
Yeah, on one hand, we took probably 2 decades to sort out the climate agenda. So we fixed long-term targets, we fixed methodologies, tools, etc. And here we're trying to do a bit the same thing for biodiversity in just a few years. So you can say it's mission impossible, but I think on the contrary, these 2 decades have taught us how to do it. So there's a lot of things that are applicable. We mentioned the TCFD, which is the basis for the TNFD. And also I think now there's a sense of urgency that is much more shared. And I think a lot of corporates, investors, policymakers understand the fact that these risks are actually material, that we're seeing them, that they're impacting our businesses and our communities, and that we need to act now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again both for such a fascinating discussion and giving us real insight into this important area of the disclosures landscape. Thank you so much for joining us. This was so insightful and interesting. I could literally go on all day. As I said at the beginning of the episode, this is our second in our disclosures mini-series. You can find the first episode on EY.com or wherever you get your podcasts, as well as all past episodes of Sustainability Matters. And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Sustainability Matters, we'd love for you to subscribe. And ratings, reviews, and comments are also very welcome. And please also visit EY.com, where you can find a wide range of related and interesting articles and reports that will help put these bigger topics in the context of your business priorities. I look forward to welcoming you on the next episode of Sustainability Matters. My name is Bruno Sarda. You can find me on LinkedIn and feel free to connect with me there. Thanks so much for listening.